I recently watched a film made in 1958 called The Anatomy of a Murder. It received 7 Academy Award nominations in 1960, including Best Picture and Best Actor, James Stewart. It didn't win Best Picture. A little film named Ben-Hur won that year. This course can be viewed as the anatomy of a real estate transaction. This YouTube is to help understand the big picture of a real estate transaction. There are many actors or players in the transaction. In this YouTube, I will give a brief summary of the material covered in the chapters in the text in preparation for Exam 1. In Chapter 1, the players involved in a transaction are described. It gives students the opportunity to also consider various opportunities for a career involved in real estate. Some of the career opportunities detailed are real estate agents and brokers who represent principals, which are sellers and buyers, lending institutions, which enable financing of real estate transactions, real estate appraising, which facilitates the underwriting and financing of real estate transactions by examining closely the market value of real estate. Property management are companies in which you put your real estate in the hands of another person to care for, rent, lease, maintain the real estate properties that you own. Title companies, which facilitate ensuring a clear chain of title and manage the closing of real estate transactions we often call escrows. Real estate and market activity are closely related. Along with material in Chapter 26, the instructor identified 4 important market forces. They are economic, environmental, social, and government. To describe them briefly, economic forces are defined as activities between consumers and business. Markets have ups and downs, and they are influenced by 3 other forces. Environmental is weather, natural disasters, concerns for protection of our natural resources. Social is about the choices that people make for lifestyle, where to live, how to live. It tracks age and movement trends of the population. Government is about the actions of government as they interact in markets. They create and enforce laws. The recent COVID-19 pandemic can identify each of the forces. Economic might have to do with the loss of jobs and the closing of businesses. Environmental might have to do with why lumber prices are so high. Social has to do with working at home, schooling on Zoom, and government might have to do with the central bank policy, which we refer to as monetary policy, and they stepped in to create a low interest rate environment, and fiscal policy, which is actions by the government, and they've been sending out a lot of stimulus checks. Chapter 25 discusses the role of zoning. In an urban setting, many types of land uses are needed to service a community, provide jobs, protect the environment, provide shopping, schools, factories, and of course, housing. Some land uses next to each other may be incompatible to maintain maximum property values. Why is it important to maintain maximum real estate values? Real estate ownership is an investment. Real estate owners benefit when enjoying land uses are compatible. Some of the land uses that are needed in a community might be factories, but factories create traffic, noise, pollution. Another service needed might be a sewage treatment plant, but they're not pretty, and sometimes they're smelly. Prisons are needed, but prisons in residential neighborhoods seem incompatible. Zoning laws in a community keep compatible uses together and incompatible land uses distant or protected in some way to enhance residential values. Chapter 2 explains the difference between real property and personal property. Real property is attached in a permanent way to the land. A movable bookcase would be personal property, but if it was attached with bolts to the wall, it would be real property. In a real estate transaction, sellers and buyers need to understand clearly what is staying, which is real property, and what is leaving after the sale, which would be personal property. In a real estate transaction, the site needs to be clearly identified in a legal way. We learned 3 legal descriptions. Lot and block track system is one of them. Can you name the other 2? What ownership in real estate means is the topic of Chapter 3. Fee simple ownership in land is the maximum rights available. A bundle of rights is described. Some of those rights might include the right to occupy and use, sell, rent, are some of the rights of ownership. In a residential neighborhood, most owners will hope that neighbors use the rights well. In other words, no weird designs, no weird paint colors, no weird statuary, etc. Chapter 3 also explained 4 important government rights in the land. They are property taxes. Property taxes pay for schools, roads, law enforcement, fire protection, parks. City, county, and state services all need funding in order to function. Property taxes are a major source of funding for those services. Zoning laws and building codes is referred to as police power. In this case, police power is not the men or women in patrol cars. Eminent domain is another government right. It is the right of government to take private property for the benefit of the greater good of the population. Usually, eminent domain is for new roads and public structures. And finally, if a person dies without a will and no heirs can be found, the state then becomes the owner of the property and will dispose of it as it sees fit. This is called escheat. To own real estate, one must take title. To take title means who will have ownership rights. There are many choices in terms of how to take title. You might be a sole owner. You might own with others as joint tenants or as tenants in common. You might own as a partnership, a limited partnership, or a corporation. But then there is the issue as to who will own the property at the death of the owner or owners. We focused on the most typical forms of ownership, which is joint tenants and tenants in common. With joint tenancy ownership, when a joint tenant dies, the property automatically transfers to the other joint tenant. For example, John and Mary own a home as joint tenants, and Mary dies. John then becomes the sole owner of the property as the surviving joint tenant. But if Mark, Ruth, Barry, and Sarah own a rental property as tenants in common, and Mark dies, then Mark's heirs, say Bonnie and Clyde, then become tenants in common with Ruth, Barry, and Sarah. But Bonnie and Clyde may not like each other very much. And then Ruth, Barry, and Sarah are really unhappy that they share ownership with Bonnie and Clyde. So you can see how one takes title to real estate is an important consideration. Since real estate transactions involve arrangements or agreements between parties, and since those arrangements or agreements fall into the category of contractual agreement, Chapter 7 explains some essential elements of legal contracts. There are 5 elements in a real estate contract that are necessary to hold up in court. Can you name them from memory? There are multiple contracts in a real estate transaction. This means there is a lot of legal work by lawyers that is inherent in real estate activity. Some of the contracts are listing agreements between real estate agents and buyers and sellers, purchase agreements between sellers and buyers, repair contracts between sellers or buyers and various contractors, rental agreements between landlords and tenants, financial contracts between lenders and borrowers, etc. A real estate purchase agreement is an integral part of a real estate transaction. It binds the seller to sell and the borrower to buy. If one or the other does not perform as detailed in the purchase agreement, there are legal consequences. That contract is generally negotiated by real estate agents who are acting for the benefits of the principals, meaning sellers and buyers, those who are involved in the transaction. In negotiating an agreement to purchase, it is typical for the seller to have a real estate agent who listed the property and the buyer to have a real estate agent who located the property that was for sale. Usually, it's located through a multiple listing service. The buyer will make an offer to purchase, which is presented by the buyer's agent to the seller's agent. The seller's agent then presents the offer to the seller. If the seller accepts the offer, the purchase is signed by both buyer and seller. An escrow is opened. An escrow is a third party which gathers all the needed documents in order to close the transaction, and then the transaction begins to move forward. Oftentimes, the first offer presented to the seller is rejected or countered with an optional offer by the seller, which may be a different price, different conditions, etc. There is no contractual agreement until both the seller and the buyer agree to the terms and both sign and date an acceptance. It should be noted that a signed purchase agreement does not mean smooth sailing until keys are handed over. It has been said that the real work begins after the purchase agreement is signed. Inspection reports requested by the buyer, obtaining financing, the appraisal, underwriting by the bank, all these can turn up unforeseen issues that may still require renegotiations in the initial purchase agreement. That's it. Thanks for listening.